Hello friends, welcome to the next module in our course. This module is titled Non-motorized transportation planning, and this is the first lecture of this module where we will be introducing all the basics about non-motorized transportation systems. The concepts that will be covered in this module are the definition and need for non-motorized transportation, their benefits, issues, different types and the comparison between the non-motorized transportation systems, as well as the planning process and overall planning process that is involved in planning of non-motorized transportation. So, let us begin. There is no set definition as in the arena of non-motorized transportation, but when we talk about it, we either refer to it as active transportation or non-motorized transportation. It is said to be a concept which prioritizes planning, operations and maintenance of walking and cycling over automobiles. So, anything that prioritizes walking and bicycling over motorized modes of transportation can be grouped as non-motorized transportation. In other terms, if it is powered by humans rather than any form of energy such as fossil fuel, etc., it may be termed as active transportation or non-motorized transportation. In our concept in India, you would see a lot of non-motorized transportation on the streets, which include cycle rickshaws, hand carts, vending carts, even the handicapped tricycles, bullock carts. So, all of this may seem as an informal mode of transportation, but they all form together what is called non-motorized transportation, and there is growing a need and demand for planning these modes into the formal transportation sector modes. So, if anybody asks you for a definition, you should be saying that anything, any system or any concept that prioritizes planning, operations and maintenance of walking and cycling over automobiles. So, that is kind of the concept of non-motorized transportation or the definition of it. Now, why do we need non-motorized transportation? So, if you look at transportation in general, if you ask anybody, any transportation professional, they would say that transportation adheres to the concept of mobility, moving people or moving vehicles from point A to point B. Whereas slowly what we are noticing is that mobility is not something that is the end all in transportation. Rather than only looking at mobility, we have to look at this concept of accessibility, because when we are moving from point A to point B, we also want to access those destinations. So, how good is the access to these points? When we look at it from the point of view of accessibility, that is when non-motorized transportation modes, their role becomes more and more prominent. So, if you look at this chart, you will see mobility actually falls within this concept of accessibility. So, initially we were when we only look at motorized transport, we miss out on these other two aspects of land use and mobility substitutes, whereas we only look at mobility itself, which if you look at other transportation motorized transportation modes, they are always dealing with capacity and efficiency. Whereas if you start looking at accessibility, then you will see that land use starts to play an important role, and mobility substitutes such as telecommuting. So, there are many offices which allows you to work from home, that is called telecommuting. So, all of these plays a very important role when it comes to non-motorized transportation. Hence, a need to go back to accessibility and go back to the concept of non-motorized transportation modes. This is a very powerful picture which is often shown when non-motorized transportation or public transportation is depicted or the need is to be conveyed to the layman or to even the public officials. So, if you see the rightmost picture, what you will see is 40 people in a bus. So, what you can see is that the space taken up by 40 people who are sitting in one bus is very little when compared to the same 40 people who are sitting in an individual car. So, there are 40 cars now moving 40 people in the second picture or the middle picture, and in the leftmost picture you will see that the same 40 people are now being moved by bicycles. So, this concept of moving people rather than bicycles is very, very essential in non-motorized transportation or even in public transportation, but we are talking in non-motorized transportation terms currently. So, what this picture conveys is that if you are only worried about motorized transportation, you take up a lot of space on the streets. So, when you take up a lot of space, you know our urban roads are very congested. There is congestion during morning peak, evening peak, and also sometimes during the afternoons on weekends. So, congestion leads to delay in travel times, congestion leads to environmental pollution. So, if we move those same 40 people by bicycles, or even if those 40 people are just walking to their destination, then the space taken up on the street is very little, and hence the congestion is lower. If you walk or bicycle, there is almost practically no emissions that is involved. So, this is a very, very powerful picture that is portrayed anywhere to the public officials or in meetings when people are asking for newer non-motorized transportation systems. So, this is the concept of moving people rather than moving vehicles. Secondly, you would also see that there are a lot of unsustainable transportation pressures that are growing currently in our society. Air pollution leads to a lot of deaths. Climate change is a reality where there is a lot of emissions that are coming out of transportation modes, motorized transportation modes. Safety is another concern. In India, safety is a growing concern because there are as we build newer and newer roads, the safety concern is also growing. Energy costs, a kilometer of road takes a lot of fuel to build. So, it is not only the fuel that is consumed by motorized vehicles, but just to build these transportation systems or these roads, there is a lot of energy required or fuel consumed, and also the concept of exclusion. So, who are we building these transportation systems for? Many a times we see that women do not feel safe in our public transportation systems. The lower income groups are often excluded from our transportation systems planning. For example, even the metros, which are considered mass transportation systems, the lower income groups often do not avail of metro systems because they feel it is not for them. So, there is always a social exclusion in the transportation systems. All these elements together make the current urban transportation scenario very unsustainable. Hence, prioritizing non-motorized modes of transport actually helps make this transportation system sustainable, and the three pillars in doing that are environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and social sustainability. So, when we are talking about non-motorized modes of transportation, we are talking about sustainable transportation modes, and by talking about sustainable transportation modes, we are talking about combining these three groups: environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and social sustainability. Moving on, when we look at the benefits of non-motorized transportation modes, you can broadly think of it in four different categories: benefits of vehicle kilometers of travel, or what we call it as VKT, benefits in local economy, benefits in the environment, which we have mildly touched upon, and health benefits. So, when we talk about benefits in vehicle kilometers of travel, so vehicle kilometers of travel is something that if you own a vehicle and you drive it 10 kilometers a day, so your personal vehicle kilometers of travel is 10. So, if you then just multiply it by the number of people living in your area or in your city, then you can understand how many kilometers of travel is there per city. So, what happens by these kilometers of travel is that you are consuming fuel, you are consuming petrol or diesel. Some of the vehicles are CNG, but not many of them are CNG in India, and electric vehicles are just starting out. So, as a result of these vehicle kilometers of travel, you are also emitting a lot of emissions. Maybe you are involved in accidents, so there is a risk of accidents, risk of death. So, all of these are creating a problem when you travel on vehicles. So, if you are cutting down your vehicle travel and increasing your non-motorized travel, so your VKT automatically reduces. The second benefits that have often been neglected, mostly in many of the non-motorized transportation system benefits when they are listed out, is actually the benefits for local economy. What we mean by benefits to the local economy is, it has been found that when you have these neighborhood shops, so shops that are small shops in your neighborhoods, they are not the big grocery stores, big chains, but rather than the small shops. Often people go to these shops either by walking, either they walk to these shops, either they go on a bicycle, sometimes they go on cycle rickshaws, which are there in many of our cities. So, what happens is these local shops benefit by people accessing them through non-motorized transportation modes, right. So, if you have good accessibility to these shops, so if you have good sidewalk connections, if you have good bicycle parking availability, if you have good cycle rickshaw stands that are accessible to the market areas, so the local economy also benefits. Whereas the big stores often are farther away from your location, they are only in one or two locations in the cities, and you only have to travel to them using some kind of motorized modes. So, when we say benefits to local economy, we mean the small shops in your neighborhood that you often access by non-motorized modes. Environmental, we have already touched upon it. If you shift to non-motorized modes of transport, you hardly have any emissions or carbon footprint, and that is currently a big issue in sustainability of transportation systems in India. As we are getting more and more wealthy, we are buying more and more cars, and that are emitting more and more greenhouse gases and making and polluting the environment. And the final thing, which is a very big benefit of non-motorized transport, and we often do run or exercise for health reasons, but now it is also being noticed that if you actually walk to your work, or you actually walk for a purpose, or not just for the sake of exercise, but if you walk for a purpose. So, for example, a purpose would be to go and buy some groceries from the local market. So, rather than taking out your two-wheeler or your car, if you walk to that place, you are actually improving your health. So, there are quantified research that has proven that if you walk with, because you find it hard to get time to in your daily activities to fit in a walking trip, because you are so busy, we are so busy in our daily lives. But if you actually substitute some of these shorter trips to non-motorized trips, you are actually benefiting your health. So, overall 4 different benefits: reduction in VKT, improvement in local economy, improvement in the environment, and health benefits. Now, what advantages do we have in the Indian context when it comes to non-motorized transportation? So, this is another chart that is often shown, which has density, urban density on the x-axis, and transport related energy consumption on the y-axis. So, what this shows is it plots different cities across different continents as per their inhabitants per hectare. So, as per their population density. So, if your population density is high, so if you are on the right hand side of the x-axis, then your transport related energy consumption is less. So, what it says is, if it is a if it's a compact city, if it's a dense city, if it's a highly populated city, the population density is very high. So what happens is your land uses are very close to each other possibly, and you are not traveling so much on motorized modes. Maybe you are, because the distances are short, maybe you are using non-motorized modes, and your energy related transport related energy consumption is low. Whereas as you move left from on the x-axis and your population density decreases, so it's a more sparse city, it's a more spread out city, then your transport related energy consumption goes up. So if you overlay the two cities, the two Indian cities that are overlaid on this chart are Mumbai and Kolkata. Those were not a part of the study when this study was done, but if you overlay them, you will see that we have very high population density in these two cities. So our transportation related emissions or energy consumption should be very low. But what is happening is, as you very well know, many of our large metropolitan cities are now growing horizontally as well. So as they grow horizontally, they are becoming there are outskirts of the cities that are less dense. So as the density decreases, what happens there is your transportation related energy consumption grows. So we have to be very careful when our city grows, so that we have good growth boundaries which do not allow a lot of transport related energy consumption, and our land uses should remain very compact. So we have inherent advantage in our cities which are slowly decaying, but if we take the right steps, we will not lose that advantage. The second advantage in our Indian context is that we almost as Indians, we do walk a lot. We do walk a lot, we do use a lot of non-motorized modes of transport such as cycle rickshaws, as well as we go to places using our cycles as well. So if you look at this chart, you would see that it's almost 17% on foot and 10% bicycle. And when we say no travel, so this is as per census 2011, no travel would indicate that maybe the person is telecommuting. So that is also saving a lot of consumption, that is also decreasing a lot of transport related energy consumption and also reducing emissions. So that is, there is an inherent advantage in our cities as well. We are mostly compact and dense cities. This is in continuation of the previous slide as well. We see that when we talk about non-motorized modes of transport, usually what we see is that people mostly travel within 5 kilometers when it comes to non-motorized travel. So walking is mostly bound to within a kilometer or so, whereas if you look at bicycling distances, on an average they are cap off at 5 kilometers. So as the distance increases, distance of travel increases, the share of non-motorized mode of transport also decreases. So the more farther you live from another land use. So for example, what I mean by land use is if your house is a land use, whereas your office is another land use. So if you live far away from your office, then you are the more probable that you will be using a motorized mode of travel, whereas if you live closer to your office, the probability is higher that you may use a non-motorized mode or a public transportation mode for that matter. So now let us look into some of the issues of non-motorized transportation in India. This is a very common sight in any of the Indian cities where you may be residing. We have wherever we have facilities, first of all, the availability of facilities are not very much in many of the cities, especially when it comes to tier 2 and tier 3 cities. We would see that there are non-existent facilities. For example, in this picture there doesn't seem to be a zebra crossing available, so people unsafely cross the road, whereas in this picture you may see that there is a footpath available, but the footpath is not complete, it's unfinished, there's half of the footpath is there, half is not there. As a result, maybe people are walking on the road itself and not using the footpath. So even the availability of facilities does not always mean that people are using those facilities. Maybe the facilities are not built up to standards or user comfort, and people are not using those facilities. The next thing is encroachment in our Indian cities. So we often hate these such kind of encroachments, but we have to also, on the other hand, think about their livelihood. So if we say that we remove the hawkers from the streets, the hawkers always resist that move because they feel that they have direct access to people who are traveling on the roads, and by having direct access, their income increases. So how do we actually solve this situation? Do we remove them from the footpaths and improve our non-motorized transportation facilities, or do we incorporate the vendors and then try to plan along with them, taking them into confidence during the planning process of non-motorized transportation? That is something we will also be dealing with later on. The other thing is we often neglect who are the users of non-motorized transportation modes. So non-motorized transportation, especially in this case or in this picture, is of what we are depicting is bicycle transportation. Now, bicycle is not only used for leisure trips, but they are almost used in many cases for livelihood. So you would see a lot of tricycles or bicycles where vendors sell their items. They come door to door for vending. So we have to take into account such kind of livelihood means of livelihood based on non-motorized transportation, and also plan accordingly. So this is sometimes neglected in our planning process. This one also shows that we don't plan for the types of facilities when it comes to non-motorized transportation. So should we allow bicycles on the right of way where there are vehicles, or should we have separate facilities for bicycles? This is a big issue. Some of the cities in India are also now looking at providing separate bicycle tracks, but does that provision of the track itself mean that lot of bicycle users would use it, or do the bicycle users prefer to ride on the right of way itself? So this is something that has to be looked at, and probably is not being paid much attention currently. And then when it comes to the types of users, so we always have to be very careful as to there may be different types of users when it comes to planning for non-motorized transportation modes. Types of different users meaning not only women, but there may be smaller children, because mothers who may be taking toddlers on along with them for a walk. There may be wheelchair access, people with wheelchair access who may need specialized non-motorized transportation facilities. So who are the users of these facilities? We have to keep in mind while planning for NMT systems. If we look at the two predominant types of non-motorized systems, if we just break it down into walking and bicycling. So bicycling may also include your cycle rickshaws or other cycle related modes. You would see that monetary cost wise, walking does not cost you anything, whereas cycling may cost you very moderate to low cost. Infrastructural requirement is not very high. Provision in India, infrastructure provision in India, although bicycle infrastructure provision is very low. So you would see this kind of gives you a comparison against different kinds of attributes, and how they are performing against each of these modes. Now if you then compare it to the car mode, you would see that the car infrastructure provision is very high and the commuting time for the same distance is low. So, lot of planning goes on in car transportation or automobile transportation planning, whereas there are a lot of benefits to non-motorized transportation, but when it comes to planning for them, we don't plan for them in a good manner. Finally, let us broadly look at what are the 5 steps. Usually it is broken down into these 5 broad steps when it comes to non-motorized transportation planning, and today we are just going to give you outline of these 5 steps, and in the subsequent lectures we will go into much more detail into each of them. The first step talks about assessing the situation, the second step talks about enabling, third is planning and design, then comes investing, and finally it comes to implementation. So, by assessing, what do we want to say is that you have to review the situation of your city. So, every city is different from each other. So, one city may require a lot of sidewalks, whereas the other city may already have sidewalks, but their crosswalks may not be good. One city may be they have a lot of access issues, so they may be sprawled out. So, how every city should have their own plans. So, there is no one size fit all kind of a situation when it comes to non-motorized planning. Secondly, you have to enable. So, there has to be somebody in the city who is a champion or who wants non-motorized transportation planning. Unless you have a vision, unless you have somebody who is championing the cause, it is very difficult to push for not only non-motorized transportation, but anything. So, you always need a champion, you always need somebody who wants to lead this effort in your city. Thirdly, you have to plan and design for these facilities very, very carefully. It is always best to have some pilot projects done in your cities and then assess the benefits or even the negative sides of it, and then go for a larger scale project. So, whenever it comes to putting in a new footover bridge, do not go, we would not advise you to go ahead and put it in all intersections. So, you have to assess carefully which of the intersections may need it, which may not need it, what are the benefits, and then go ahead and plan and design. Next comes investment. Although the non-motorized systems do not need a lot of funding to be invested, but funding comes very, very rarely for case of non-motorized transportation systems, because mostly funding goes towards large motorized transportation projects. So, when it comes to looking for funding, we have to look at innovative funding sources, different types of funding sources, and once you get them, you have to allocate it properly and use it up in your budget so that the systems that you want to implement are actually built on the road. Finally, it comes to implementation. So, implementation, we always stress upon that it is not only once you build it, but you also have to take care of it. So, operations and maintenance plays a very important role. We often see sidewalks that are built newly are very good, but their conditions deteriorate very quickly, or the crosswalk paint dries off and nobody repaints it on time. So, it is not only implementing it the first time, but you have to always operate and maintain it as well. So, that concludes our first introduction lecture on non-motorized transportation systems. What we looked at in this lecture was the different forms of non-motorized transportation systems, the need for it, the different benefits that non-motorized transportation systems have. We also looked at several issues in non-motorized transportation systems, especially in India, and also how India has some inherent benefits that it can gain. And also finally, we looked at the 5 key steps in the planning process. These are some of the resources that you can use for learning more about what was taught today, and I look forward to having you in the next lecture module. Thank you.